I would like to start off by acknowledging that I'm joining you today on Zoom from the traditional territory of the Kwamlindun First Nation and the Gwitchin Council here in Whitehorse, Yukon. I feel very honored to have the privilege to work, live, play, learn, and to be raising my family here on these beautiful lands. I would also like to acknowledge and give thanks to Vuntut Gwitchin government, Gwitchin, and Champagne and Ajax First Nations, who agreed to work with me for my PhD project and who welcomed me on their traditional territories over the last few years. I'm really happy to have the opportunity today to share my findings from my PhD research with a broader audience, and looking forward to some of the discussion at the end. I've been taught by many of the elders that I work with and First Nation mentors here in the Yukon that it's always really important to position yourself in the work that you're doing. So I just wanted to start off with a brief introduction. I am a daughter, sister, wife, mother, and teacher, and of importance to this project in particular, I am also a student and researcher. I was born and raised in Edmonton, Alberta, on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis and settlement to many other Indigenous peoples. On my mother's side, I am sixth generation Canadian, and my ancestors came from Ireland, Scotland, and England. My late father was first generation Canadian and was adopted to a Polish family in small town Alberta. Since 2010, I have been living here on the traditional territory of the Kwamlindun First Nation and the Gwitchin Council, with a 3-year period where I traveled back and forth between Saskatoon and Whitehorse when I was completing my PhD coursework. I studied under the supervision of Dr. Ken Coates at the University of Saskatchewan School of Public Policy. At the end of 2016, my husband Mache and I permanently relocated to Whitehorse to start our family, and in the spring of 2017, our daughter Beata was born. Since then, I continued to work on my PhD research, and since 2018, I began working as a full-time faculty member here in the Indigenous Governance degree at Yukon University. I wanted to provide a little bit of a brief background context to this research for those of you who may not be as familiar with the modern treaty history context here in Canada. Modern treaties are government-to-government partnerships between Indigenous peoples, the federal crown, and either a provincial or a territorial government. They are negotiated and signed in areas where land and resource rights have not previously been settled. In other words, they're located in areas that did not have pre-existing historic treaties signed between Indigenous groups and the Crown. They are seen as being amongst one of the most important legal and constitutional documents in Indigenous affairs in Canada today. And there were a number of key historical events that took place that really pushed the federal government to open up the possibility to negotiate modern treaties here in Canada. The first being the Calder case, which took place between 1971 and 1973. The Calder case involved the Nisga'a Nation in northern British Columbia. The Nisga'a decided to sue the government of British Columbia, seeking a declaration that title to their lands had not been lawfully extinguished. The case was unfortunately lost in the BC British Supreme Court, and again in the BC Court of Appeals. And in 1973, the Supreme Court of Canada saw the case. Although the case was ultimately lost, it became a landmark decision, as this was the first time that the Supreme Court of Canada had recognized Aboriginal title to the land as a pre-existing right. Prior to this case, governments had been acting as if Indigenous peoples had no legal rights to their traditional territories, even if they had been unceded. This landmark decision was central to ultimately pushing the government towards negotiating comprehensive land claims. Parallel to the Calder case taking place, the Yukon First Nation chiefs, under the leadership of Chief Elijah Smith, traveled to Ottawa in 1973 to lobby the government to begin land claims negotiations here in the Yukon, where we hadn't previously negotiated treaties of any sort. They presented the historical document Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow. And in August of that same year, Prime Minister Trudeau finally agreed to open up negotiations of modern treaties and released the first federal comprehensive land claims policy. 2 short years later, we saw the successful signing of the first modern treaty in Canada, the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement in 1975. To date, 26 modern treaties have been negotiated and signed across the country, and there are an additional close to 90 negotiations that are either in progress or have completely stalled, and many of these are located in British Columbia. The negotiation of modern treaties really signifies an important shift in redefining the ongoing legal, political, and economic relationship between Indigenous groups and public governments in Canada, and is intended to symbolize a long-term commitment to reconciliation. However, the approach to implementation over the past 45 years has resulted in strained relations between Indigenous signatories and their government partners, and has led to numerous court challenges. Much work has focused on the negotiation of modern treaties in Canada, but little work within the research realm has really looked at the experience of land claims implementation specifically. The Yukon is often looked to as a success story for the historical achievement of negotiating the Umbrella Final Agreement and 11 individual final and self-government agreements. Between 1973 and 1993, the Umbrella Final Agreement, also known as the UFA, was negotiated and signed. Although the UFA isn't in and of itself a modern treaty, it was the framework document that was used to negotiate the individual Yukon First Nation final and self-government agreements. Each final and self-government agreement contains the same components and provisions that can be found in the UFA, in addition to its own specific and unique provisions for each First Nation. 11 of the 14 Yukon First Nations have successfully signed modern treaties. And this means that 11 out of 26 modern treaties in Canada were signed here in the Yukon, which is why the Yukon really provides a foundational case study for better understanding the experience of modern treaty implementation in Canada. Specific implementation achievements have varied between each of the Yukon First Nations, but there have been areas of shared priorities across the Yukon First Nations. And these achievements have occurred predominantly in program and policy areas such as health and social services, education, economic development, heritage and culture, and lands and resources. After the signing of the agreements, each of the First Nations focused on setting up their own governments and administrations and preparing for drawing down program and service delivery. Another key priority was to establish all of the intergovernmental boards, councils, and committees as outlined in the final and self-government agreements. These include councils and boards such as the Land Use Planning Council, the Yukon Heritage Board, Fish and Wildlife Management Board, and the Water Board. Implementation, however, is still being neglected in the territory, and the barriers and challenges to modern treaty implementation have often overshadowed many of the successes that we have seen. Although change has occurred in more recent years to the approach to implementation at both the federal and territorial level, meaningful and direct action has occurred in small steps at best. When I was trying to determine the focus of this research a few years ago, this was something that I was hearing over and over again from people I met with across the territory and across the different levels of government. The photo on the screen here was taken at the signing of the Peel Watershed Regional Land Use Plan. The land use planning process for the region was a very contentious process, as many of you know, with significant implications for the relationship between the government of Yukon and Yukon First Nations governments. I discussed the Peel land use planning process as a case study in my PhD dissertation. After 15 years of consultation, protests, court battles, and changes in government, the land use plan was finally signed. Pictured here are leaders, elders, and youth from the First Nation of Gwitchin, Gwitchin, Vuntut Gwitchin government, the Gwitchin Tribal Council of the Northwest Territories, and Yukon government. The Peel watershed case really exemplifies the importance of intergovernmental relations for honoring the spirit and intent of the agreements and truly seeing them successfully implemented. So recognizing the significant gap in understanding the complexity and importance of modern treaty implementation here in Canada, the purpose of this research was to answer two main questions. How have the partners in the negotiation of a modern treaty managed the transition from negotiation to implementation? And what can this transition reveal about the modern treaty process in Canada? This study set out to answer these questions by examining the experience of negotiating and implementing modern treaties in the Yukon between 1986 and 2016. More specifically, after gaining permission and consent from 3 Yukon First Nation governments who had expressed interest in being involved in the project, I drew on the direct experiences of Champagne and Aishihik First Nations, Gwitchin, and Vuntut Gwitchin government. Over the period of approximately 3 years, I conducted interviews and follow-up interviews with 43 individual participants. These participants represented former and current negotiators, leaders, elders, and people currently working within implementation at the federal, territorial, and Yukon First Nation government levels. Due to the limited documentation of the experience of implementing land claims in Canada, the interviewees themselves were the subject matter experts for this research. This provided a much greater understanding of both the direct and indirect impacts and effects of land claims implementation. The key findings that I'll be speaking about today came from these interviews and discussions. There are certainly things that I wasn't able to capture and things that I didn't hear, but I really tried to find overlapping experiences from these 3 Yukon First Nations, recognizing that each has had unique circumstances. For this reason, I specifically chose not to do a direct comparison of one First Nations experience against another, but instead tried to find overarching and common experiences and themes that could be drawn to better understand the overall experience of modern treaty implementation. A bit of an explanation for why I specifically limited the scope from 1986 to 2016. Other than the fact that my PhD committee kept cautioning me to really find a much more narrow scope for looking at the implementation experience here in the territory, there was a specific reason that I chose these dates in particular based on the first set of interviews that I conducted. And I'll just quickly go through some of these key points in the timeline here. As mentioned in 1973, Chief Elijah Smith and the Yukon First Nations chiefs went to Ottawa to present the historic document, Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow. And this ultimately began the process of negotiating land claims here in the Yukon. Between 1973 and 1984, we saw the negotiation of the Yukon land claim. And in 1984, the first agreement in principle was tabled for a ratification vote. Unfortunately, the agreement in principle failed to be voted on within the ratification. And at this point in time, the federal government actually decided to put the negotiation of modern treaties on hold while it reviewed its federal comprehensive land claims policy broadly across the country. In 1986, when the federal government returned to the table, they came with a new federal comprehensive land claims policy, which for the first time mandated that implementation had to be included as part of the negotiation process of land claims agreements. One of the major lessons that had been learned from some of the earlier negotiation and implementation of agreements like the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement was that there had been little to no discussion of what it would look like to put these agreements into action, and there was no implementation planning that had been done on paper. In fact, the James Bay and Northern Quebec were already in courts due to the failure to implement their land claim agreement. So the federal government mandated that from that point on, all land claims agreements had to include a separate implementation plan as part of the negotiation process. Also in 1986, when the federal, territorial, and Council of Yukon First Nations came back to the table to start negotiations again, they came back to the table with a renewed commitment to seeing these agreements successfully negotiated. This meant taking a new approach to the negotiations that was no longer adversarial. And it also came with making a commitment to spending a lot more time directly in the communities that were going to be affected by these land claim agreements. One of the things that I heard a lot from the negotiators of the Umbrella Final Agreement was the importance of this commitment that was made to spending time in the communities and to building relationships across the different levels of government amongst the parties at the table. Ultimately, it is said that these relationships that were built were one of the main reasons that led to successfully signing the Umbrella Final Agreement and the first 4 Yukon First Nation final agreements. So that's the reason that my research started at 1986. Fast forward to 1993, we know that in that year, the UFA and the first 4 Yukon First Nation final and self-government agreements were signed. Between 1993 and 2006, we saw the signing of 11 Yukon First Nation final agreements. The first 4 were Champagne-Atiak First Nation, the First Nation of Natchanaik-Dun, Tesit-Tlingit Council, and Vuntut Gwitchin. In 1997, we saw the signing of the Little Salmon Carmacks Agreement and the Selkirk First Nation Agreement. In 1998, Gwitchin signed, followed by Ta'an-Quachin Council in 2002, Kalani First Nation in 2003, Kwanlin-Dun First Nation in 2005, and finally Carcross-Tagish First Nation in 2006. At this time, the federal mandate for negotiating land claims agreements had expired, and this left 3 Yukon First Nations, White River, Liard First Nation, and Ross River Dene Council without having completed land claim agreements. The reason I specifically chose to end the research in 2015 and 2016, when I was doing my first set of interviews, the Harper government was still in power at the federal government level, and we were just heading into an election period, both at the federal level, but also at the territorial and CYFN level. At the end of 2015, we saw the election of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau at the federal government level, and in the territory at the beginning of 2016, we saw the election of Premier Sandy Silver and Grand Chief Peter Johnson at the Council of Yukon First Nations. The reason this was significant is that in the election campaigns for all 3 of these leaders, they specifically made a commitment to redefining the treaty relationship amongst the parties to the agreements and renewing the commitment to successfully seeing these agreements implemented. And this was a significant departure from the approach and the prioritization of land claims implementation that had been seen over the previous 10 plus years. So this is the reason that I capped off my research at 2016, was that we were seeing this shift towards a really hopeful time in seeing a change to the approach to modern treaty implementation. I thought I would share a brief experience with you, which really reaffirmed the relevance of my research at a sort of an important transition period when I was right in the middle of conducting my interviews. In January 2019, I was invited to take part in the First Principles Project gathering. Yukoners, both First Nation and non-First Nation alike, hold a lot of pride in the Yukon land claims and see this as a key part of Yukon's history. This gathering was an opportunity to reflect on the experiences and brought together many of the original leaders and negotiators involved in the Umbrella Final Agreement negotiations between 1973 and 1993. The project was in response to the lack of knowledge and understanding of the main principles and the underlying intent and content of the UFA and the Yukon Final and Self-Government Agreements. It was acknowledged that those involved in the negotiations have had a very limited role in implementation. The weekend gathering opened with a reading of the names of the prominent people who contributed to the UFA, who are no longer with us. This was testament to the importance of having this gathering, for fear that we are losing many of the people who are knowledge holders of this era. The timing of this gathering was at such a critical point in my own dissertation work and paralleled many of the discussions that I had been having with interviewees from all 3 levels of government. It allowed me to identify some of the key gaps in my existing analysis and really validated several of the key findings that had been emerging from my interviews. So there are several findings from this research that I really do hope will inform future land claims implementation and intergovernmental treaty relations in Yukon and across Canada. And I'm just going to provide some high-level overview of these findings today. Should any of you wish to read a 200 plus page dissertation, I can provide the link in the chat at the end. So first, negotiation is only one step in the overall process. Those involved in modern treaties cannot underestimate the importance of implementation. And this can be said of public policy in general. We so often focus on the agenda setting and the development of public policy with very little focus on planning for putting that policy into action. And the same can be said about the experience of land claims implementation. Over 20 plus years were spent negotiating these agreements. And by the time the pen was hitting the paper, everyone thought that the bulk of the work was done, but little did they realize that it was just beginning. At the federal and territorial level, there was also brand new implementation planning teams coming in who had spent some time at the negotiation tables, but didn't always have a thorough understanding of everything that had gone into the negotiation or the intent behind each of the chapters of the agreement. One thing I heard a lot at the Yukon First Nation government level was that almost the exact same group of people that had spent the 20 plus years negotiating were also going to be the same people that were implementing the agreements and doing the implementation planning. And by the time they came to that point, everyone was so exhausted from the amount of time that had been committed to ensuring that these agreements were successfully negotiated. Second, we need to have a clear understanding of the goals and the original intent of the agreements. And this was something that really came through at the First Principles Project gathering. Today, the number of people working in implementation at the federal and territorial government level, but also within the First Nation governments, have very little understanding of the original intent behind each of the chapters of the agreements. And this has had really severe implications for how they're interpreted and how they're being implemented. Further to this, there has been very little overlap between the original negotiators of the agreements and those working in implementation today. And one of the things that really came out from my interviews was the need to capture some of that original intent while we still have access to many of the original negotiators. And there also needs to be much more robust training and workshops and education for federal and territorial employees around the roles and responsibilities of implementing each of the chapters of the agreements. Third, it's important to recognize that Indigenous peoples are the co-creators of these agreements. These are government-to-government agreements, and this needs to be foundational to implementation. But this hasn't necessarily always been the case. So often I heard that First Nations feel like they are constantly the one having to push the federal government and the territorial government to meet their responsibility to seeing these agreements successfully implemented. I also often heard that the federal government often views their role specifically as fiscal responsibility when it comes to implementation. However, if these are truly government-to-government agreements, everyone has a much broader role to play in seeing the spirit and intent of the agreements implemented. Finally, relationships built on trust, respect, and a shared commitment to honoring the spirit and intent of the agreements will be key to seeing these implemented. And I'm going to speak to this again in just a moment. In the past, scholars have really underestimated the impacts that political and administrative people, structures, and processes have had on negotiations and implementation. And from my research, there are two key elements that are needed to facilitate successful implementation. The first one are that these multi-party agreements are complex and require a sound knowledge of policies, processes, and structures. Throughout the 45 years of modern treaty implementation in Canada, 28 years here in the Yukon, we have predominantly witnessed only slow and incremental changes to these policies and approaches to modern treaty implementation. The Federal Comprehensive Land Claims Policy that was released in 1986 was barely ever amended until a new interim policy was released under the Harper government in 2015. Despite a number of court challenges, Senate Standing Committee reports, and other significant research reports that identified some significant gaps in that policy, and particularly in the approach and structure of implementation planning, it took from 1986 to 2015 to make a significant change to that policy. And to date, the interim policy that was released in 2015 has yet to be completed as a standalone policy. In addition, in that 2015 interim policy, we barely saw any departure in language from the original wording in 1986 around implementation planning and the specific standalone concept of having an implementation policy. Despite much lobbying from groups such as the Land Claims Agreements Coalition, there still has yet to be more robust language around implementation planning directly in that Federal Comprehensive Land Claims Policy. One of the Yukon First Nation representatives that I interviewed argued, and I quote, the biggest challenges to implementation was that other governments weren't willing to change their policies and practices to embrace self-government. We also need to be able to see a shift away from these small incremental changes and lofty promises towards more actionable outcomes. Within the current federal and territorial government's approach to modern treaty implementation and intergovernmental relations, we've certainly heard a lot of rhetoric and big promises and verbal commitments made. However, these political and policy promises have rarely translated into substantive action. And I don't think this is limited to modern treaty implementation. We're hearing this across a lot of different policy areas. Second, an understanding of the human dimensions of putting these agreements into action is going to be key. So often in the study of public policy, we focus so much on the structures and the processes and even the bureaucracy, but we forget about the people. No matter how you look at it, the people are the center of these agreements. The people who fought for together today for our children tomorrow, the people who sat at the negotiation table for 20 plus years to get successful agreements here in the Yukon, the people who are working to put these agreements into action today, and the beneficiaries of these agreements for the next 7 generations. Central to the success of modern treaty negotiation in the Yukon were the relationships built on trust, respect, and a shared commitment to seeing these agreements successfully negotiated. However, throughout implementation, we have seen an unraveling of these relationships over time as a result of changing governments, changing policies, and changing priorities. So what comes out of all of this? All parties to the agreements must have a clear understanding of the goals and original intent of the agreements, as well as a clear understanding of the historical, political, socioeconomic, and cultural contexts that really underpin these modern treaties. Without this foundational understanding, it is difficult to truly explore and execute the spirit and intent of the agreements. Critical to the successful implementation of the treaties is an understanding that all parties to the agreements are striving to achieve the same goals. It is expected that different governments are going to have different objectives, interests, and values, but this does not mean that they cannot work towards common goals and outcomes. Fundamental shifts in cultural perspectives and concepts of governance will be required in order to achieve the spirit and intent of the agreements. This is going to require system-wide changes internally within the federal and territorial governments to significantly alter their approach to implementation, how they view their roles and responsibilities, and being able to think beyond the black and white letter for letter obligations. Many of the people that I interviewed for this study talked about the fact that this system-wide change did in fact occur in the Yukon between 1973 and 1993, and is ultimately what led to the signing of the UFA and the first 4 Yukon First Nation final agreements. But then we have seen a regression of this change and this commitment to these relationships throughout the period of implementation. To date, we still have not seen this level of change occur within the Government of Canada. We need to remember that Yukon First Nations and First Nations across the country are living these agreements every day and experiencing both the direct and indirect impacts of the failure to implement the agreements. So where are we today with Yukon land claims implementation? As I mentioned towards the beginning, the year 2016 marked a really hopeful time for significant shifts in the approach to intergovernmental relations and land claims implementation here in the Yukon. As I sat down this past spring to prepare for my PhD defense, I found several key success stories across the territory. For example, just this past spring, we saw the release of the new Yukon First Nations procurement policy. On the other hand, there has also been recent examples that demonstrate an ongoing disregard for honoring and implementing the agreements. Just this past March, for example, the First Nation of Natchonayagdun filed a petition to the Yukon Supreme Court, claiming that the Yukon government had breached its duty to consult by unilaterally approving a mineral exploration project in the Beaver River watershed. Natchonayagdun has been waiting since the signing of their land claim in 1993 to complete a land use plan for their traditional territory, which could have circumvented this experience from happening. The quote on the screen here is from the petition filed to the Supreme Court and makes a powerful statement about the impact that neglecting the commitments to treaty implementation can have. And I'll just take a moment to read it out in case some of you are just listening without video content. Absent a fulsome Crown commitment to treaty implementation, First Nations and all Canadians risk a return to the grim reality of the colonial past, with the commitments to protecting Indigenous interests, fulfilling treaty promises, and advancing reconciliation as nothing more than empty words. Remarkably, in the history of Indigenous newcomer relations, these modern treaties are quite new, and it's important that the spirit and intent of the agreements never grows old. The agreements are intended to set out how a unique and dynamic partnership will work now and in the future between First Nation and non-First Nation Yukoners. And all levels of government need to stay committed to seeing these agreements implemented. Thank you very much. And I will pass it over for questions.
Thank you very much, Rhiannon. That was extremely informative. If anyone would like to ask questions, you can just raise your hand and then I can call on you. Or if you would prefer to send it directly to me, you can do that or put it in the chat. So Heather has a question. Go ahead, Heather. I'll just have you turn your audio on. We cannot hear you, Heather.
It's Heather here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My question is, in the Yukon here, I see that, first of all, let me tell you, I'm a survivor of a residential school citizen from I am 60 plus years old. I'm considered a young elder in as far as my First Nation. But I'm also from an interracial background, of which my father spent. My father came to the Yukon in the late 50s and spent his whole life in mining in the Mayo area, working for United. My understanding from conversations with my parents and my mother before she passed was that the original intent was that they recognized that there was a need for employment and therefore exploration or extraction of resources, and that we would hopefully benefit from that instead of not. However, fast forward now, I don't actually see that happening for First Nations and so are actually benefiting from that, and part of it is maybe capacity, and the other part is just, I think, systemic kind of racism. And just even as a Yukoner as a whole, I don't think the Yukon as a whole truly understand how resource rich and how that is fleeting. Once it's gone. And we're not really, as a Yukon territory, we're not really benefiting from it. And as a First Nation, definitely not benefiting from it. I just wanted to know how you see that in the like. I really believe we need land use planning so everybody knows where they stand. All the players in the game know where they stand and the same rules. But how do you see that panning out? Because I mean, why do we have to go to? Why do we all do you see us having to go to court? It seems like we're always having to go to court just to implement an agreement we already have. How do you see that? Do you see that changing in the near future? Do you see a change, or do you, like, I pray there's a change, but do you see that actually happening, or what do you see the biggest barrier there?
Yeah, thank you for your question. And I hope I caught it all. The phone was breaking up just a little bit. I do think in regards to reliance on the courts, and this is something that I focus part of one of my chapters on, is we do have the dispute resolution mechanisms in the final agreements, but they have been very underutilized. And so often reliance has been placed on putting these issues in the courts. And I think there's a number of different reasons why, and without the legal expertise, I won't dive too deep into it, but I do think that there's some reliance on precedent setting. There's a desire to have precedents set within the courts. And I know, speaking to some of the people around the Peel watershed, ultimately that was one of the main reasons for continuing to pursue this in the courts, is that we didn't want to see a situation like the Peel watershed happen again with land use planning, knowing that we have so much more land use planning to do here in the territory. There is always a risk, obviously, of having things go to court. And there's also lots of negative connotations in terms of the relationships that were built, the trust that's there amongst the different levels of government, and the implications that can be had based on the decisions that's made in the courts. I also think the other thing that I heard a lot from people working within dispute resolution is that one of the reasons we don't see that chapter being used as often is because the trust isn't necessarily there right now between the different levels of government. And if we're going to truly use dispute resolution mechanisms, you need to have trust amongst the different levels of government that are going to the arbitration or mediation tables. In regards to land use planning, I think, as I mentioned, the Peel watershed plan process and experience has really made it so that nobody wants to revert back to that experience again. And I know that there is a concerted effort right now to work on land use planning. At the same time, we're also seeing a number of First Nations taking on land use planning themselves and sort of putting aside the process that's outlined in the agreements and finding their own Indigenous-led approaches to land use planning. And we're seeing a really strong example of that right now with Karkras-Tagish First Nation and Quanlin Dun First Nation, and I believe it's Ta'an, that are all three working together on their own land use planning process.
Thank you, Rhiannon. Thank you, Rhiannon, and thanks, Heather, for the question. We have another question that was sent to me directly. It says, Chief Stephen Charlie announced publicly that Laird First Nation is preparing to enter self-government negotiations in January of 2021. Chief Charlie noted that in contrast to the existing 11 self-government agreements in the Yukon, LFN does not want to negotiate their modern treaty under the umbrella final agreement. LFN does not want to cede, release, or surrender non-settlement land. And considering developments such as UNDRIP and the calls to action, TRC calls to action, the person would just like to know what your thoughts were on this situation.
Specifically the situation that they don't want to negotiate under the umbrella final agreement?
That is the way that I'm reading it, that they don't want to they don't want to negotiate under the umbrella final agreement. They don't want to cede, release, or surrender the non-settlement land.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we're actually seeing this a lot in the across British Columbia as well, and a lot of the nations who have unceded territory, is that they don't want to pursue the same sort of comprehensive process of negotiating modern treaties to the extent that they did in the Yukon. I should also just mention as an aside that the federal government has actually said that they will never negotiate a comprehensive land claim agreement as extensively as they did with the umbrella final agreement here in the Yukon. So there isn't a commitment to seeing a fully robust negotiation process of comprehensive land claims such as we saw here in the Yukon. That being said, at the time of negotiations, the three First Nations who didn't sign, and Liard First Nation being one of them, Ross River and White River being really outspoken about it, they did not want to negotiate an agreement under the same framework that was set in the umbrella final agreement. And in fact, today, there's a brand new negotiation process taking place called the Recognition of Rights discussion tables. And rather than negotiating comprehensive agreements, these are really specifically looking at specific rights areas. And this is an approach that is being taken by Liard First Nation and White River. And I'm not sure, to be honest, about Ross River, but I believe that they're also at the RIRSD tables. And we're seeing a lot more of this happening across British Columbia. And this is allowing people to pick very specific areas of recognition of rights that they want to either draw down or negotiate into agreements, rather than having to cede all rights or territories or lands outside of what's agreed upon in the agreement. So I think we're going to see more and more of this form of agreements being made, rather than sort of more comprehensive modern treaties.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rhiannon. Are there any more questions? We have time for maybe one more quick one. If not, I would like to thank Rhiannon so much for sharing this information with us. And I know PhD research comes with a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. So it's hard to distill that down into a short presentation like this. But I think I can speak for everybody here when we all felt your passion on the topic, and definitely your extensive knowledge. So thank you so much. I truly appreciate it. And thank you to everybody for joining us today. On this day, I'm in Saskatchewan right now, and we're in the middle of a blizzard. So I was late because my power had went out. So thank you for bearing with me. Our next talk in the speaker series is actually me on December 7th, I believe, correct? And I will be talking about engagement in the nuclear energy sector. So I'll be sharing some of my PhD research and what I've been working on with my previous master's, and all the research I'm doing currently. So if you'd like to come and chat with me about nuclear and engagement, by all means. And thanks again, Rhiannon, and thanks again to everybody else who spent their lunch hour with us.
Thanks everyone for joining us. And for the couple people who asked about my dissertation, I've just put it in.
Perfect. And we did have one more question that was just sent to me. It says, hi, Rhiannon, great presentation. I may have missed this, but in regards to implementation, what is in place for ensuring the government is listening and acting, or what steps should be taken individually or collectively to ensure?
This federal government in particular?
I think it says government in general. So I would suggest probably the federal government.
I think there are different things taking place at the different levels of government. As I mentioned, this federal government under Trudeau really did make a significant commitment to modern treaty implementation. We saw the development of a new branch specifically focused on land claims implementation. However, what we're seeing is that it's not those big decision-making mechanisms at the top, or the policies or processes that are being developed aren't necessarily trickling down to the bureaucracy level. And so we're seeing a really slow shift to change within the bureaucracy level of the people who are actually doing the work on the ground of working with the First Nations. The other thing that I heard quite a bit is that the federal government, most of the people working with an implementation are located in Ottawa and spend very little time here in the Yukon. And I think we are slowly, outside of a pandemic context, seeing a bit of a change of seeing more people spending time here. But I think that there is significant work to be done to seeing that happen more. I also, when I presented on some of this work at the Land Claims Agreements Coalition workshop back in 2019, I did hear that significant work was being done around trying to develop more educational tools and training for employees, but that was still very much a work in progress. So the recognition is there that that work needs to be done, but I think it's going to still take quite a bit of time before we see that developed into action.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks again, everyone.